Welcome to Stories of Brisco and Bradshaw. I would be Bradshaw, and that would be your Chickasaw native, your Chickasaw Hall of Famer, Oklahoma's favorite son, Mr. Gerald Brisco. And we got a treat today because not only Keith Greenberg, I've known a very, very long time, written a ton of wonderful books, but written a book about what Mr. Brisco and I think are the most important time in our sports entertainment history, whatever you want to call the genre that we're in. Bigger, better, badder. All about the WrestleMania, the start of that, the killing of the territories, the whatever you want to call it, the Vince McMahon era that starts. Keith has written a book about it. It's absolutely fantastic. Keith, welcome to the show.
Hey, and guys, both of you, thank you for inviting me.
Keith, this is the most interesting time, I believe, in wrestling history. Mr. Brisco and I talk about this all the time. It's whenever we get guests on that were around in the 80s, one of the questions we always ask is, did you know what was going on? Because what was going on, I mean, this is Game of Thrones type stuff to me. It's just, I think it's just an interesting time. Is that the reason that for this book?
The germination of this book occurred during the week of WrestleMania 39. And I found myself for the third time insisting to someone at the bar at the Rainbow on Sunset Boulevard that if it wasn't for WrestleMania III, WrestleMania week and all those ancillary activities would not exist. And, I was already writing for the WWF magazine at the time. And I'm like, I better start interviewing these people before they and I are all gone. But I do think it's a very decisive year because when you look at what was going on in the other territories, the Von Erichs had peaked. Bill Watts ended up selling to Crockett that year. Crockett was still kicking, but a year later, Ted Turner would come in and take over. So really, I feel that's the year when Vince really turned the corner and the territory system was really on its last legs.
You wrote in your book about the different territories and where they were in time with this, the mid 80s, and how what the progression they had, the response they had to the guys from up north, as we always just call them. A few guys called it WWF. It was always just the New York guys.
Right.
New York.
Did what of the territory guys, which had the best chance or any chance of countering what Vince was doing?
Well, I only have to rely on what people told me. I would say certainly Jim Crockett had the most attention, and he was running shows in the Northeast. Now, his brother tells me in the book they weren't always making money on those shows. But, I was writing for the WWF magazine, but I'm a lifetime fan. And I can remember going with Lou Gianfrido, who was a writer for the WWF magazine, to a show in New Haven, an NWA show. I remember going to a War Games show at the Nassau Coliseum on Long Island as a fan. And in 1986, on a UHF station, they would show, and it only lasted a few months, they'd show World Class, they'd show Bill Watts promotion, they would show NWA from Charlotte. Those are all pretty exciting shows, but I think that in terms of just the outreach, I think it was Jim Crockett. In terms of creativity, I'm going to say Bill Watts. If it was just based on creativity alone, I think he had a great episodic TV show that maybe in some ways was ahead of the WWF product on that.
Keith, I was waiting to see where you went with this. I thought maybe you were going to say Crockett because of the assets that he had, but in my mind, during that time frame, you're taking a look around because you're working for a company that's selling, 2-3 years old. And in this case, at WrestleMania 3 years, basically, a little bit over 3 years old. And you start wondering, after WrestleMania I, or do we have that, what it takes to be forever company here? And you start thinking, I'd been in the business a long time. Well, who's sharp enough and who's got the assets enough to challenge this guy because he's in the media capital of the world. Crockett, I knew Crockett so well because I'd worked their territory so many times and spent so many hours on the road. I knew that they didn't have that ambition And I think that's really what hindered them more than anything. Without Dusty Rhodes and Jimmy Crockett deal, Jimmy Crockett probably would have never left Carolina and probably might still be prospered in those three-state area that they had. But I started looking around. Vern, well, no, Vern's up there at 8. I don't think Vern got. Well, like he said, I'd already seen the Von Erichs self-implode, through all the tragedy that they were having. The only guy left that I thought in my mind was the Cowboy Bill Watts, because Bill was smart, he was aggressive, he wasn't afraid of nothing to challenge anybody or anything. So I thought, he would, if he'd end up with that asset at TBS, which he had for a while,
Right, and he almost had it.
Yeah, that he would be the one to challenge us, and that was my only concern. That Cowboy really said, "Okay, this is it. I'm going to challenge him," but he'd done burned himself out through all the aggravation and losing talent and all the stuff. But
I mean, look who came, but look who he had. He had Junkyard Dog. He had Jake the Snake Roberts. He had Ted DiBiase. He had Hacksaw Jim Duggan. Look at the impact those guys made.
Yeah.
Can you imagine if Bill Watts was able to hold on to those guys?
Junkyard Dog. I mean, we were
and Steve Dr. Death Williams. I mean, that would have been some competition.
Yeah, we talk all the time about Starrcade, the first Starrcade, having potentially 10, 12 Hall of Famers on that first Starrcade card. Well, Bill had that almost nightly in his territory. He had a bunch of future Hall of Famers there that we kind of tend to overlook at times. And so the talent, Bill had the talent, and Bill had the wherewithal and the knowledge on how to do things like that. So he was the only one that really, and like you said, he did the episodic TV that he inherited from Eddie Graham down here that everybody respected so much. Bill used to say, I got my master's degree at Oklahoma, but I got my PhD degree with Eddie Graham, and that's how we all felt. We got that extra degree from Eddie that kind of sparked everything.
Right, and that was exported. But think about, here we have John Layfield sitting here. Had Bill Watts remained in business, that's a guy who Bill Watts would have grabbed, because his performers, not only was the storytelling good, but they were all very believable. You all believe that in a real fight, those guys would kick everybody's ass. And that's what I think, as a fan, made that promotion so compelling.
But Keith, how many years now have you been in the business, and what kind of made you want to decide you want to get into this crazy business?
I mean, I was a fan. My grandparents lived in Brighton Beach, Brooklyn. They were immigrants from the former Soviet Union, and they were 100% absolute true believers.
What country, by the way? Was it from?
My grandfather was from Lithuania, and my grandmother was from Belarus.
Yeah.
And I can remember Bruno being attacked on TV, and my grandmother wanting to call the police, because not only did she not realize that it was taped, she thought it was going on right in her neighborhood. Like, that is pure belief. You don't even realize you're watching television at that point. You feel like you're looking outside your window. So having been in that environment, I always wanted to get close to it. And that's why I was such a fan when I was backstage, sometimes to my detriment.
Hey, Keith, I want to continue with that line of thought, but I want to go right back for just a minute to around 85, 86 and ask you about the territories and the competition. Was anybody at the time, because it seemed like at the time, reading, because I wasn't there, it seemed like at the time Mr. Brisco was, so I'll ask both of you, were there any of the territories not only trying to stop Vince McMahon, because a lot of it seemed like we're saying, what do we do to stop him? It didn't appear, at least from what I've read and people I've talked to, that people had the same vision as Vince. Like, hey, let's take over the world. All they wanted to do was stop Vince from taking over the world, but they were going to leave a void there for somebody to do it because they didn't have plans to do it themselves. Is that right?
They couldn't unify either. I mean, both Greg Gagne and David Crockett tell me that in the book. And, Bill Watts also says that. Everybody is cutting each other's throats. Nobody's really united. And Jerry lived that. Like, Jerry knows. Jerry was being exported around the country. So Jerry knows how distrustful the promoters were with one another, right, Jerry?
That's exactly right, and nobody. I mean, it goes back to what I always say, and that's what I admired them for more than anything else was the loyalty that these NWA promoters. They didn't care about other places. All they cared about was protecting their rear end, and they would do anything to protect their rear. And if it meant teaming up with you, Keith, I would team up with you if I thought it would help me protect my area. So they didn't have that vision. And and I've said it a million times. I'll say it here today. The reason why we decided to go with that in the beginning, I mean, we'd made the offers, to sell Georgia Championship to other people within the organization, and they kind of scoff at us, or they call Ole, and Ole would say, well, he's trying to rip you off and all this stuff. The company isn't worth that. Now here's an owner, which honestly we didn't know Ole was an owner until we started selling the damn. Tried to sell our stock, and we found out, and that's what saved our ass on the lawsuit a little bit later on. That sell in our bylaws, before you could sell your stock, you had to offer it to other people within the organization. But so when Watts decided he wanted to sell, he didn't offer it to anybody but Ole. Ole was the only one that wanted to buy it. And so they made that sell and didn't tell any of the stockholders. And so we were blindsided when we found out Ole Anderson's a partner. He's a what?
So you thought it was still Bill Watts?
I thought Bill Watts still owned the stock. Yeah, exactly. And so when we were calling around trying to get ourselves, we called Watts. And Watt said, I've sold my stock, guys. I want out. I'm already out. Wow. So my point is when we met with Vince sat down. We sat down with Vince at LaGuardia Airport at one of those, I think it was an Eastern executive rooms that they used to rent out for meetings up there. We sat down with Vince, and Vince was by himself that day. And the rest of the time we negotiated it with Vince and Linda. But he sat down and he told us what his vision was. And it was similar to what Jack and I's vision saw, because thanks to Eddie Graham educating us on cable TV, we saw what was going on with cable TV, and Vince realized what was going on with cable TV. And we're wanting to expand, but those NWA guys, the whole point of the question were loyal to each other and wouldn't expand into each other's area there. Where Vince didn't give it, he didn't have those loyalties. But listening to his vision, just say, man, this is the guy that we want to throw our hat with.
And think about this. And Brian, I'm one of the few who's already read Brian Solomon's book about Gorilla Monsoon that's coming out. Vince had dispensed of his partners. Everybody else still had partners who they needed to accommodate. And that's what gave Vince, in my opinion, a strength that the others didn't have. Vince only had to answer to Vince. And I think that made him very unique. Am I right?
Yeah. You're exactly right. Yeah. And that was always our saying too. Well, we know who our boss is. We got one boss, You go down that place down south, as Vince used to call it. He never would say Atlanta. He said that place down south, And you didn't know day to day who your boss was. And we knew who our boss was, and we knew who our boss was going to be tomorrow. And they did not know. So that an organization, that's so important that the guy that you can go to and air your grievances or make suggestions, and he'll listen, where nobody and down south knew where to go to. So.
And back then, let's remember, for those who who were younger than us and started following later on. Back then, I remember Vince McMahon even being accessible to me. Steve Lombardi's quoted in the book, like he was a jobber and Vince McMahon was accessible to him. So that's a very different Vince McMahon from the Vince McMahon we saw later on.
Yeah, the Vince McMahon we saw later on, you could see it when I came in '95. He was still very, very accessible, and he still go out with the boys, still do things. That faded away pretty quick. Pretty soon he became kind of untouchable, but for a lot of reasons, and because
it's not his fault. Not all the reasons is
100%. There was so much to do. I've been on the plane with him, just like Mr. Brisco has. where you'd fly into the next town and he'd sit there till 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, literally just talking business. Then he'd go to the gym and get up in a few hours and talk business again. It was business with Vince 24/7. He once asked me, he goes, "How in the world do you play golf and stay out there for 4 hours?" He thought it was the worst. He thought it'd be like being in hell because he couldn't work for that 4 hours.
He compared it with sitting in a dental chair one time. Him and Pat were. He said, "Pat, I'd rather sit in a damn dental chair for 4 hours than sit on the golf course."
Although I'm going to say something which hasn't been publicized because obviously Vince catches a lot of heat these days. But when I was at Freddie Blassie's funeral, I sat at a table with Vince, Linda, Shane, and Marissa, Shane's wife. Just us at a table. Vince did not look at his phone. He did not get up from the table. He was there to celebrate the life of Freddie Blassie, and he did not do business there. He sat there because that event meant something to him. Now, that's tied to his warm feelings for Blassie and the connection with his father. But I feel privileged to have witnessed that side of Vince McMahon, and I'm sure both of you have as well.
Yeah, didn't you find that unique in Vince McMahon? I mean, he was so loyal to his dad's friends. I mean, they weren't exactly his friends because they were a different age group, but he respected them so much from his dad and seeing how they contributed to his dad's success that the Vince idolized all those guys, and he treated the as we call them nowadays, legends, as good as he treated the guy that was selling out Madison Square Garden for him every night.
Right. Now, I'm actually curious about something because we say without WrestleMania III, we wouldn't have what WrestleMania is today. Not just 2 nights, but all these other events that take place on WrestleMania week. I mean, I'm promoting this book. I'm doing a signing at WrestleCon. That's not a WWE event. But, it's not just WrestleMania. Like, John, all that stuff you did with the troops in Afghanistan, in Iraq, could that have occurred without the immense success of WrestleMania III? Would WWE have had that kind of credibility that the U.S. Army would work with a wrestling promotion?
That's a great question, and I don't think so. WWE may have got there eventually. You don't know what history would have been. You take one piece off the chessboard, you don't know how it moves all the other pieces. But I think you're right. Without that WrestleMania 3, without that huge draw, and Hogan being on the cover of Sports Illustrated, being in the big movie with Mr. T, with Stallone, with all of the celebrities that are coming around, and a change from this, old VFW bingo hall type business that people perceived us as, which they did, to this nowadays it's part of every type of other entertainment. It's equal. It wasn't quite equal with when we did the troops, but without WrestleMania 3, I think you're right. I don't think any of that happens. I mean, I don't think the deal happens. I just don't think any of it happens. It may have happened later, but it certainly doesn't happen at that time frame.
Right, because think about how immense that was. I mean, you were organizing it, but just the association, and I tie that back to when I was a kid and people would mock me for being a wrestling fan. And it was inconceivable that the United States Army would be doing business with any wrestling promotion in the world.
Right.
Well, you're talking to one of the guys that made that happen.
Yeah, I know. But there were people around who were receptive to him.
That's right. They were very receptive. And a lot of that had to do with, the fact that because of WrestleMania 3 and Hogan, Hogan became such this great big star. He was so articulate, but it was Vince. I mean, it's all Vince. If you take one of these pieces out, it's hard to say what happens. You take Hogan out, does the same thing happen? Can you plug Dusty in? I don't know. No,
right. We don't know.
History will never know, but you had the right guys at the right time.
Yeah.
I remember when Shawn Michaels, first time he got on the cover of a magazine, it was Playgirl, but still, the first we didn't get on the cover of nothing back then.
Right.
From Hogan's days until Shawn Michaels, we weren't on the cover of anything, and all of a sudden it became mainstream.
I mean, I remember in 1982, I was 23 years old. I was hustling. I wrote a story for Us Weekly about how disappointed Bruno Sammartino was that his son wanted to be a wrestler and not go to college. And the fact that that was in a national magazine and no one knew who I was at the time, suddenly people in the wrestling business knew me because I wrote an article about professional wrestling that received national coverage. And then 3 years later, it's WrestleMania I.
Isn't it kind of interesting, Keith? You know, you talk about how wrestling has gone ups and downs, and I think it's because of attractions, not just because of a cyclical, chronological reason. When you have attractions, business is up. When you don't have attractions, it's down. I think that's what makes it more cyclical. But when Londos was big back in the 30s, you had Primo Carnera, you had Max Baer, you had Joe Louis. You had somebody. Joe Louis was the referee of one of Mr. Briscoe's matches. I mean, you had a lot of guys that wanted to be part of it. Gorgeous George was the same. When Gorgeous George came in, Muhammad Ali famously, got a stick from him. So you had different times that were huge that celebrities wanted to be a part. But after WrestleMania III, that's when wrestling kind of went toward the mainstream, for good.
Right. And it really went because Gorgeous George was around for a couple of years. As we know, he had a lot of personal demons. By 1963, he was dead. Jim Londos, he wrestled a long time. But again, it was a different era. There was no television. The wrestling promotions could not maintain that level of popularity. Even Buddy Rogers and Pat O'Connor in 1961, it was a limited shelf life. I remember, and I talk about this in the book, speculating how long would WrestleMania last. Once WrestleMania III took place, I don't think I'm the only one who was confident that it was now going to last. It was a genuine institution.
And I love the fact in your book that people say, "Well, that's the peak. We're dead now." Wrestlers are so streaks and downers.
And some of that is cynicism. Like I remember 1986, I finish another book, a non-wrestling related. I go down to Puerto Rico on vacation, but because I'm, such a fan, I just end up going to bars and hotels where wrestlers are. I'm already on that circuit. And I end up like smoking cigars with Abdullah the Butcher. And Abdullah's like, oh, this WrestleMania II in 3 cities, Vince is going to get killed. He's going out of business. And you know how Abdullah always liked to talk about money. He's throwing all these figures at me, like boggling my mind. But I think that was a lot of wishful thinking for people who weren't invited to the party. And in fact, I know that because when I left, Abdullah said, make sure you mention me to Jim Barnett that you saw me.
Tremendous. Hey, tell us real quick the story. It's such a great story. The Colossal Tussle story.
Yes. And Jerry Brisco in a roundabout way has a role in this because you and your brother are the ones who brought George Scott in. Is that correct?
Yes.
So Vince is apparently brainstorming about ideas for the first name, the name of this event. And Vince is insisting on Howard Finkel suggests WrestleMania like Beatlemania. But Vince is adamant about the Colossal Tussle. And suddenly George Scott...
That is such a bad name.
George Scott decides to shame Vince by doing a Jim Barnett imitation and skipping around the room and going, oh, the Colossal Tussle.
I could just see that too.
And then he skips outside the room and Vince goes, come back in here. It's WrestleMania. Breathe.
That is fantastic. Jim Barnett is such an interesting character to me. I'd love to have a book on Barnett. It's just so...
You never get anything. When I wrote the book with Flair, Jerry put me in touch with Barnett, and I was overjoyed. I'm like, wow, I'm going to find out. I'd say this in another book. I'm going to find out so many secrets. I'm going to have to kayfabe myself. And Barnett gets on the phone with me, and he doesn't give a thing away. He answers me like he's doing an interview with, a newspaper in Georgia in 1965 and just not telling me anything inside.
Really? And what year was this?
This would be, the Flair book came out in 2004, so this is probably 2004.
That is great.
What a unique character he was.
That is fantastic. So when the closed circuit first starts coming in, I didn't realize you had some pay-per-views with it. The only ones that were really trying to do that were Crockett and Vince, right? Because now what I heard, and I assume this is true, is they talked to Fritz about doing either closed circuits or pay-per-view for the David show, and Fritz didn't, for whatever reason, didn't understand it, didn't want to do it.
That's what the director said. He didn't understand the technology. He wasn't a technical guy. And it's like, that's not the wrestling business. And to be fair, everybody was uneducated. Everyone was learning as they went along.
But now somebody's going to take over. I mean, what's crazy to me is the territories. You would think you would realize that, when Blanchard gets USA Network, you would realize that somebody is going to take over the national deal, and it's going to kill the territories. It seems crazy to me that Vince was the only one. Was Blanchard? Did he have that in mind? Was what his goal was?
I don't know if I mean, you knew Joe Blanchard, Jerry. I don't know if Blanchard had that kind of national vision.
I knew Joe, and I never knew Joe to be a really forward thinker like that. I think he was like everybody else. But he was also a step ahead. He was kind of like an Eddie Graham mind-wise. He saw the cable business. I think if Eddie would have really wanted to, Eddie and Watts would have teamed up, and I think it would have been competition at that time. I'm not sure about Blanchard. I think he was still a little old school to kind of step into that. And I think he took that at ESPN, USA Network, whatever it was that he had, just because it was an opportunity to get it programming on air. I don't think it was with the intent, I'm going everywhere.
I really can't imagine that. And I don't think he was a great payoff man either. Am I correct?
No, he wasn't.
And so now you contrast that with Vince, and Vince certainly was.
Before we get to WrestleMania III, WrestleMania I, was it as big a risk as what people said it was? And reading your book, it hadn't occurred to me before what a risk it was for the talent too. That if the talent sides with Vince and Vince doesn't make it, they could end up blackballed as well.
Or at least they felt that. I mean, that was
Mr. Brisco knows that very well.
Jerry knows this. I mean, the guys who worked for Ann Gunkel, did they get hired again? Yes, they did. So I think that was a recurring threat in professional wrestling. Like, if you go with this guy, you're blackballed. If your box office, you're welcome back. My opinion.
So do you know, as far as the financial risk of WrestleMania I, there's so many rumors about it. apparently Vince did mortgage his home, but then there's also there's a million different rumors that are very fun and very very fun to entertain. Like, I kind of hope that happened because that's pretty cool.
Right.
Everything from taking mafia money to taking loans, putting money in one bank into another, borrowing money off the borrowed money.
If he did that, he's a sheer genius.
I mean,
100%. 100%. It's like one of those things. I hope it's true because that's really cool.
I mean, but the thing is, again, you have to take everything from its source. Superstar Billy Graham told me when he testified against Vince at his steroid trial, the prosecutors were trying to find mob ties between Vince and the mob. I think if there were mob ties, those prosecutors were pretty zealous. You talk about a weaponized Department of Justice. When it came to Vince, they were weaponized. They never found any ties. Hence, I think either Vince was really good at hiding things or it's a spurious rumor.
Well, you don't have to find the mafia ties. Just look at the athletic commissions.
Right. I mean,
they're right there at the Garden. It's pretty simple.
It's true.
Which
it was so funny, back in the day after we made the sell and WrestleMania I coming up and there, you're going to go broke, Brisco. You're not going to get any of your money, and number one, we got just about all of our money up front, but that was the thing going around. Vince ain't going to pay you guys what he owed you, and it was more so that we got our money for our stock, but we both had consulting contracts that that honestly that some of the guys gossip and everything kind of got to us, and say, well, is the guy really going to make it, or we're just going to end up with our stock instead of our consulting fee, which kind of made the deal a sweetheart deal for us. But that was always the rumor, Vince won't pay you, Vince won't pay you. That was never anywhere in our spirit of thinking that he wouldn't pay us.
But I love the rumor about Vince borrowing money on borrowed money.
I do too.
I don't know if it's true, but it's sure fun talking about it.
Oh, I've heard it a couple of times. I have no idea if it's true. None whatsoever. It's but when you hear about it, you're going, "That's pretty cool if he did that."
Yeah. That's genius.
Was WrestleMania I as much? I know we're getting to WrestleMania III, but was WrestleMania I as much a zero-sum game as well? I mean, if WrestleMania I doesn't hit, I mean, you got to battle Starrcade. Is Vince set back pretty much? I don't know about forever, but for a long time.
I mean, the only thing I know is from what people told me. So, I don't know if it's folklore or if it's legit. It's like the wrestling business. We don't always know. Like, did Travis Scott really puncture Cody's eardrum? Or is it a work? As a fan, I don't know these things.
Right.
I can only sit back and speculate and have fun like we're having fun speculating about Vince borrowing money from borrowed money.
Well, then let's speculate on Evel Knievel. The hell was Vince thinking?
He wanted to be a promoter.
I've talked to Vince about it. Talking to Vince about it is awesome. He said, well, the guy said he could make it. But it was more than that. Vince talks about the Evel Knievel, and it's a funny story because they'd say, well, how'd it go? He'd say, as we say when you lose all your money, it was an artistic success. And so anytime me and Michael Cole were out there, we'd see a match that was really bad. We'd say that was an artistic success. And Vince every time we get there, go, both of you are fired, you smart asses. Artistic success.
Yeah. But you have to remember, I mean, I'm older than you, not older than Jerry, but older than you.
Nobody is.
Knievel, in American pop culture, he was over.
Oh, beyond over. Had the biggest selling toy. I'm one of the biggest Evel Knievel fans in the world.
So, I mean, it makes sense that, he's trying to branch out beyond his father. I mean, Evel Knievel is somebody Vince can obviously relate to, and everyone's into Evel Knievel.
But this is like Wile E. Coyote, though. I mean, you're tying yourself to a rocket.
He's going to jump over a mountain, basically.
Yeah, you're tying yourself to a rocket, and you're going to land in what, soft dirt on the other side?
Yeah.
There was no landing ramp. He was shooting himself across, just hoping he survives the crash.
Well, he did have a parachute, and he ended up floating into the Snake River. So
he got lucky. He ended up on a dry. He could have ended up in the river. He got lucky to the ground.
Yeah.
But Vince also had the Inoki fight that didn't do very well. I mean,
he had a role in it.
My point is, Keith, is that Vince. People just talk about Vince comes along, all of a sudden everything just golden for him. It wasn't golden for him. He had a couple business failures. He had 2 huge promotional failures. He came up really tough, and so when he decides at WrestleMania I, this is not a sure thing.
No. But the thing is, this is a guy, there were 2 qualities. He wouldn't quit, and he would learn from his mistakes. Now, I don't know if later on Vince ceased learning from his mistakes, but I imagine he continued to do so. So when he had a setback, he didn't remain in that mindset. He propelled himself forward. And, before we started rolling, we were talking about other people who worked for Vince. And I remember being backstage, and the boys were offended because I'm a fan. What am I doing? I should be sitting in the audience, not walking around backstage. And then I was offended because there were executives there who weren't wrestling fans. It's like, how dare these people be privileged enough to come back here and they don't even love the product? But what Vince was doing was Vince was bringing in people who were experts in their various fields. They Basil DeVito was a sports executive. There were marketing executives. There were television executives in the so-called legitimate. And he didn't care if they weren't wrestling fans. Jim Crockett wouldn't have done that. Bill Watts wouldn't have done that. Fritz von Erich certainly wouldn't have done that. You had to be part of the closed society. So, Vince that's taking a risk too, because the fear was if you bring in people from the outside, they're going to expose the big secret, hence the business would die.
Right. And, I worked in some territories that were pretty good. Otto Vance had a great territory over here with Peter William. I worked in some great territories in Japan and Mexico. None of them had an infrastructure like Vince. It's what Mr. Brisco and I talk about all the time was Vince was not just building talent. He was building infrastructure. He was building his TV product with a second generation guy in Kevin Dunn. He was building the whole marketing infrastructure, which none of the territories had, right? I mean, Vince was literally putting together something. Vince was putting together a business. Is that right, Keith?
Yes, he was putting together a business. Interestingly, you mentioned Kevin Dunn. Kevin Dunn was Dennis Dunn's son. Dennis Dunn had worked for Vince Sr. But that's true. He was a television expert. Nelson Swegler had started his own production company. He was not a wrestling guy. And these guys were all brought in for Vince because Vince wanted a structure like structures that the NBA and the NFL had. And you played in the NFL. I'm sure you saw some parallels, and I'm sure you saw many components of Vince's machine that was much better than what you witnessed in the NFL.
Yeah. I can't speak for the talent on that case here, but I can speak for the old agents that would work, the Lanzas, the Scarpas and the Gurrias and Renee and Arnie and all that guy. Every week we'd go to TV and you see a new suit there. Who is that guy? Well, he's supposedly director of marketing. Well, what's he do? I don't know. What marketing department? None of the guys actually knew what position. I mean, okay, he's head of marketing. Well, what's the marketing guy do in our business? He's head of promotion. Well, what the promotion head of promotion guy do in our business? He promotes our product. Well, we promote our product. But none of the old timers could really get it through their mind what was going on. But I was trying to advance myself. I was trying to go up that ladder as quick as I could. So as soon as those guys would come in, I'd befriend them, and I would start because I needed it for my position because he made me a local promoter. I didn't know anything about that. I was a wrestler, and so I relied on the DeVitos, the Swaglers, and the Kevin Dunns, and the Webbers to teach me about promoting the business and how they were doing it nowadays instead of how they were doing it back in the Eddie Graham days. So we all would look and here comes another suit. I guess, Gino, Gorilla Monsoon always had a great quote because we'd see them come in, sometimes be 10, 15 new guys saying, who are those guys? Brisco, you don't have to waste your time. Don't commit their name to memory because they won't be here long. And
in some cases,
that's one thing about Vince. He did weed those guys out real quick that didn't want to be there.
He did. And I can remember having conversations with guys who I didn't know and them acting as if, well, I'm only doing this for the money. And, and it's just wrestling. And those guys, I was taking an instant dislike to them and I was offended by them. And as soon as Vince found out, I don't think they were gone right away. I imagine Vince tortured them a little.
That's probably accurate. Vince would say, you fire them at your convenience, not theirs.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I know, Jerry. I know you've heard him say that because you fire them when it's advantageous to you, not when it's advantageous to them. Keith, I wanted to book, but the Dennis Dunn story, you brought that up. I think that's really interesting. The way Kevin, his father went blind, right? That's why Kevin took over the.
I'm not sure that. I know there was a story where Kevin and his father were bringing the tapes to one of the TV stations, and the car caught fire. And his father said, "Just make sure you have the tapes."
But his father, from what I understand, was his father. Is that right, Jerry? He started becoming blind, and that's when Kevin did the right thing for his family and took over the business and ended up
And
becoming.
took over, yeah.
And did the right thing for
Kevin didn't really want to. Kevin wanted to be a football guy.
That's right. And became, I think, one of the greatest producers in television history.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, certainly we would, I always say this when I'm with other wrestling fans and they're like deciding to trash Vince McMahon. It's like, hey, none of us would be sitting here all together from a WrestleMania. None of us would be in this bar in Las Vegas were it not for Vince McMahon.
Yeah, true.
That's right, because he created all of this that ended up because someone was going to do it. I mean, it just, the way television was going, the way technology was going. What I found interesting in your book was, and I was aware of this by meeting with Vince back in the mid 90s when I would get the chance to travel with him, and so would Mr. Briscoe, was his vision about what comes. He always had this vision of 20, 30 years down there of going public with the company, which I didn't know until I saw something in your book about it. It was much earlier than than anybody else would have dreamed of.
Yeah, Bruce Pritchard noted, that's what Bruce Pritchard got there. He arrived right after WrestleMania III, and so he was hearing Vince talk like that. And of course, at the time, a wrestling company going public,
right?
Well, if you're going to have partners, you might as well legitimize it.
Right. Which, which they also did it very wisely. They went to NASDAQ first and NYSE.
Yeah, I remember.
Next year. See, you got a 2-for-1 out of it, which was pretty smart. But I heard him, back in the mid 90s, and Jerry heard it before that, talking about having academies all over the world in different continents and global television and global offices. I mean, it's pretty remarkable the vision he had back when you're starting WrestleMania I.
He had us in 1994 or 95. I can't remember. It was when Osprey was still there because he's on there. But he had all the office people, all his inside office people that traveled with him, that worked with him on a daily basis. Write a deal on our perception of what a WWE developmental camp should be, what it should be, all the ingredients that we thought it should be. And I still got a couple of those letters. John, I'll share it with you. I'll send you a copy.
Your shed treasures keep getting better, Jerry.
And it's funny now.
Your shed treasures keep getting better.
I know. They do.
You think about that. Like there was a relationship with UPW in California where John Cena trained, and there was a relationship, of course, with OVW. So that was the forerunner of the Performance Center. And even though I don't think the London Performance Center still exists, that plan was at least, in the beginning stages of being put into action. And now we're in the Paul Levesque era, and I could certainly see that plan eventually coming to fruition at some point.
Another thing that was interesting was the magazine that Vince owned. A lot of people don't know Vince was getting into different things. Whether his father knew when he got into it at the time or not, but we've had Bill Apter and George Napolitano on, who's just fantastic. Talking about the magazine that Vince had. Why did he have a magazine?
Because he understood that was media. Vince was not limited to just the in-ring product.
He could control media. That's right.
But he had the magazine before he had the territory, right?
Yes, that's before he bought out his father. But George Napolitano, and it's in the book, worked for the magazine. And there was only a couple of issues, but it was a window into what was coming. It's not like he did something, it didn't work, and he pushed it out of his mind. He was still looking to the future. It's like, I'll take that experience, I'll put it in my back pocket, and at some point I'll take it back out of my.
We're moving on, and not like we're doing it in order, but I guess that's the way to do it chronologically. WrestleMania II just seemed like something that there were no adults at home watching it. I mean, it seemed like it got away from Vince, and I don't know if that's true or not. But from reading your book a little bit, it kind of seemed like there were some details that were left that weren't covered, which is very unlike Vince.
Yes, I mean, I think this is how I interpreted it. I never asked Vince about this, but I had the impression, as someone who grew up watching the territories, that Vince wanted to tell the world. I have a show in New York. I have a show in Chicago. I have a show in Los Angeles. Territories don't exist. Every major city is mine. That's what I felt Vince was trying to convey. And, Nelson Swegler, who was the vice president of television production, said they didn't even have enough camera people who knew how to shoot wrestling in 1980s.
The recruiting of the staff, I mean, they had to go out and recruit local staff, basically, what they were doing.
Yeah, they had freelancers who didn't know, they didn't have the product knowledge. By 87, by WrestleMania III, they didn't need to go out and get outsiders in there. They had those people in place. And they, to a very large degree, had the technology in place. 86, they were still floundering.
Tell me about WrestleVision.
I guess WrestleVision was a concept that, and I watched that. What was that tournament? The Wrestling Classic. I remember I didn't have cable yet, but I think somebody, well, I was working for the office. Someone probably gave me a VHS tape when I was in the office. Yeah, I didn't go to the office much, but I was on retainer. It was Vince's attempt to do, it was a pay-per-view only. There was not a closed circuit component to it. And it didn't really fly. And then Vince pivoted to what worked.
Which is, to me, is one of the most amazing things about Vince. People ask me what's his best trait. His ego is not in the product in himself so much that he won't get away from something that's not working. It really is day one thinking. When he says that, that is 100% legit. If something's not working, if the Bodybuilding Federation isn't working, if ICO Pro isn't working, if XFL isn't working, he will pull the plug on it. If WrestleVision
cut your losses.
That's right. Cut your losses and go on. And that's a remarkable trait for a CEO, to not have such a big ego that they got to make things work even when they realize they probably shouldn't.
Yeah. And, I guess that's the sign of a successful business person. You have to try a lot of things before you hit.
And they also drew a heck of a house in Toronto, right? I mean, they drew some great houses.
In Exhibition Stadium. And I don't know if I think you said, Jerry, you were not at Exhibition Stadium.
No, I wasn't.
But, I always assumed that was almost a dress rehearsal for WrestleMania. But from what you and others told me, it was a big show. It sold out a stadium. But Vince had another vision entirely for Mania.
That's exactly right. I mean, all the big shows were just big shows. I mean, and if you take yourself to that time frame, I mean, everybody was doing big shows. Bill was doing the Superdome. Crockett was doing the Starrcade. Vern was doing his big shows. Fritz was out there doing the Texas Stadium. So it was just, okay, it's just another big show. And that's really how everybody kind of perceived the thing as it went along. Nobody had any clue that, this was the forerunner to something that would go down in history as being
right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you talk about Fritz. I mean, the Dallas promotion had been doing doing that Parade of Champions in 61. Those things were in place. Right. But, I think, though, Vince was proving that he could go into a stadium and sell it out. But WrestleMania III was far more spectacular than that.
So tell me about WrestleMania III. Tell me about the genesis of it. Tell me about what you've written in your book. Tell me about WrestleMania III.
Well, Basil DeVito is quoted in there, and he's worked in sports management, and he knows that, there's curtains, and you go into the Pontiac Silverdome. The Pistons had played there, or were playing there at the time. And you put the curtains around and you block out seats. And he's like, okay, what's the seating? He doesn't think they're selling it out. And Vince's like, no, we're selling out the stadium. And now Basil's nervous, and Hulk Hogan turns to him and says, are you forgetting who's in the main event, brother? But now Vince tells his staff, and this was told to me by numerous people, he didn't want to see one empty seat. And when Vince says something like that, he's not just like, it's not just a figure of speech. If Vince looked at that monitor and saw one empty seat, somebody would be crucified.
Yes.
Well,
Yes.
I can back that up. I mean, like I said, I was a novice promoter, and all of a sudden, I'm promoting their TV down here, and and there was the Sundome, it had the bright yellow seats, and he hated the yellow seats. It almost prevented us from ever doing a pay-per-view. There was the yellow seats plus the transparent ceiling that they had. It's much like the Pontiac
Like the
Superdome.
Silverdome, yeah.
Yeah, they had that ceiling there. But if he saw an empty seat, your ass was getting. You better get ready to pucker it up real quick because it's getting ready to get kicked. But he hated. And when I saw that and this fantastic book that he took Basil out and said, "See this? I forgot if it was in
It
Providence
was
or
at
where
Poughkeepsie.
you see those empty seats there. That's your responsibility." Well, then Basil, in return, us local like me and Zane Bresloff that you cover in your book, where we're told at TV, you make sure that you sell this side. We're instructed where to sell first and how to sell those seats and how to have a seat filler, which I didn't know anything about at the time. Basil smartened me up on it. Have your
It's
seat fillers ready. If somebody gets up, go to the concession stand, you better put somebody in that seat across from the hard camera.
So who were the seat fillers? Now I'm curious.
Who or what?
Like, were there people standing in the back who worked for the company who would be dispatched, like, get in that seat right now?
Yeah. The question, Jerry, was who were the seat fillers?
Like, who were
Oh
they?
yeah. Well, I was a Kappa Sig, so I would call the Kappa Sigma fraternity. Say, hey, I need 20 people over here. They would send me 20 people, or I'd go over to Orlando. I would call one of my local wrestling coaches that things and then, hey, I need you send me some guys over here. They get to go to free wrestling. And I never had any trouble getting seat fillers because they get it for free.
So
Quite fascinating.
you just have these seat fillers standing by, and if somebody
Yeah,
comes up and went to the restroom or something,
yeah,
and they're opposite the hard cam, they'd be seen.
yeah,
You
yeah.
you would tell them to go to sit in that seat.
Yeah, we'd have 20, 30 guys or girls standing over in and the breezeways where you couldn't see them. And you'd see somebody get up out of their seat to go to the bathroom. You would send two guys down there real quick because you didn't want that hard camera all of a sudden flashing over there. And all of a sudden, Vincent, where's Brisco? Where's the promoter? Who promoted this crap? So you would set them down there. And as soon as they get back, you get up and you get out of your seat and you go.
That's fantastic. I had no idea. I didn't know that. That did Steve.
Yeah.
I guess Steve Rubin probably did that later, right?
Well, Steve Rubin did it later, but that was
Steve would,
Steve's main job. There was fill those seats at ringside, yeah,
and he'd move people around. Steve was
yeah,
great at what he did.
yeah,
Terrific at what he did.
I remember during one of the flat periods for the WWF or WWE, we were in upstate New York, maybe in like Delhi, New York, and there were all these empty seats on the top. You went through those days, Jerry, where the business ebbed and flowed. And I remember like one of the promo guys like looked at the arena and he said, "What's the Duvetine budget for it?" Because remember covering up those seats with Duvetine. Nobody's doing that now.
yeah.
Yeah,
Well, they don't need seat fillers now for sure.
Yeah.
But yeah, and going back to WrestleMania III, the staff that he was building to build that arena to capacity like that was phenomenal, and that's something that I think really separates that company from the other wrestling companies out there. The Vince knew that he had to have specialization in all these fields, and he kicked everything aside to make sure that was done there. But I don't think it could have been done without the Hogan and the Andre, the brotherhood of that match there, how that transpired there.
No, I mean, they were fascinating people. And you know what? This came up in my research, but I asked Orndorff's son about it. He said he had never heard this. There's been a rumor circulating since that time that Paul Orndorff was on reserve to fill in case Andre couldn't make it. I mean, I think that Vince would have brought Andre down on a gurney if he needed to. Am I correct? There was no plan for Orndorff to be the backup, right, Jerry?
Right, exactly. That's a good analogy there.
Jerry, Vince has always had, different guys around in case something happens, similar to like, UFC has a fighter around in case something happens. Taker was always around in a big match, just in case something. So it may have been something like that. It may have been something like, in case something happens, which completely unexpected, a car wreck, you name it. It could have been your own standby. So it could have been true, but not to the thing of we think Andre can't get there because physically, something could occur.
Yeah.
Go ahead, John.
I'm sorry. One other thing. Before I get to WrestleMania, I want to talk to you. I want to ask you about something that Pat Patterson has told me personally, and probably told Jerry personally as well. Was WrestleMania I? I know we're skipping back, but Muhammad Ali. This is what a lot of people don't know. You had it in your book. Muhammad Ali was already suffering from cognitive decline.
Mm-hmm.
And he literally, Pat went to Vince and said he cannot be in the ring as a referee because of his mental, not instability, but like dementia, for lack of a better word.
Dementia. It was the early stages of dementia, actually.
Yes. It was the early It's so funny you say that. I remember WrestleMania I was when I was actually offered the retainer with WWE. Ed Raschuti, who was the editor at WrestleMania I, said, "How would you like to work for us?" And I remember going through the back and seeing Muhammad Ali standing backstage and a bunch of people I didn't know, but they were not wrestlers. They looked like hangers on. They may have been staff at Madison Square Garden, were posing for pictures with Muhammad Ali. And they were moving him around, including folding his fingers into a fist and making him hold it up. And I thought, wow, this is really demeaning. Why doesn't he have people here to protect him?
Right. Yeah, which was a lot of people didn't know that story. I saw it in your book, and that's the only other time I've heard it mentioned. Other than then Pat literally told us. Pat went to Vince and said, "Hey, Muhammad he can't be the referee," and because of the cognitive decline that he was apparently under, and Pat saw it, and that's why they moved him to the outside and put Pat in the ring, and that was a last minute decision there that a lot of people are not quite aware of that. That was done because
the way I understand that, John, that actually Hogan was going through the matches and he kept repeating things to Muhammad Ali, and Ali would say, "Yeah, I got it." Then they would start doing it, and Ali would be completely out of position. And Hogan, I mean, we all know Hogan started panicking at the time. How are we going to do this match? Because there's so much going on there, and then this guy can't remember what position to be in. So he told Pat, and that's what Pat went back and told Vince, "Hey, I got to do it." Because Hogan's the one that asked Pat to be the referee.
Yeah, it's just such an interesting story that so few people know.
Keith, talking about WrestleMania I, and then we kind of lightly mentioned, what WrestleMania turned into. There were guys literally that flew into New York that day for WrestleMania I.
Wyndham and Rotundo did.
Wyndham and Rotundo and did their match. And then back in those days, they were red eyes back to Tampa, Florida. They went back and they got the red eye the next day and flew back home. They were there just basically for the match, and they were in and out of there. And now it's like Bruce Pritchard called me the other day and he said, "Man, I got to go to Vegas for WrestleMania." I said, "So?" He said, "Man, we're out there for 10 solid days this time."
Wow.
Well, that's what that event has grown into.
Right. So, think about this.
Flying in that one day and doing your match and getting the hell out of Dodge and then coming back 2 days later for TV.
Speaking of Pritchard, when I finished the book, I sent Pritchard like an early... I think I sent him the first draft, but he's a busy guy. I'm very curious to hear what he thinks of the book.
He will read it. Bruce is the guy who reads. If you send him something like this, and he knows you also, so he will read it. Bruce is about that. Bruce loves reading.
And if he knows his name's in the book,
especially if he knows his name's in the book.
But I would send him if he's up for it. I'll send him a PDF of the current version, not the first.
He'll be pissed off, Keith, because my name's in this book more than Bruce's name's in.
And he'll count it.
He'll tell me too.
Yeah.
He'll count count them out. He'll have a little counter there counting the damn things.
Hey, Keith, one thing you had in your book, Bigger, Better, Badder, was very interesting to me. And it's Jerry talked about WrestleMania being an event now, kind of like the Super Bowl or Daytona or whatever it is.
Or the World Cup.
It's unbelievable. It's an event now that people won't, are willing to pay to come to their towns, not just allow you to have. Totally different. Was the dynamic that Vince was advertising several hours away and trying to tell people in other towns, which was different from
unprecedented, because previously it didn't matter if it was Starrcade. Greensboro would have Starrcade. Where would that be marketed? Be marketed in Greensboro and Charlotte, that area. It wasn't being marketed in Roanoke, Virginia. It wasn't being marketed in Savannah, Georgia. Maybe if you were in Savannah, you were enticed to come to the one in Atlanta. But here, Vince, they advertised. They had a number you could call on television. So anyone who was watching the syndicated show could come to WrestleMania. And people did. Few people were going to WrestleMania during that period by car. But I did interview a few people by airplane. But I did manage to track down a few people who did, including Raphael Morphy.
Great story. I loved reading that story because I love Raphael.
Yeah, he's a great guy. And of course, later on, he became an executive in both WWE and AEW. And Raphael was the captain of his baseball team at Archbishop Malloy High School. And the coach benched him because he missed an exhibition game and and chose to fly out to WrestleMania.
And an exhibition game on top of it, like you said.
Right. And the coach could not understand why his star baseball player would take a weekend, and risk being benched for a wrestling show. Nowadays, everybody understands. It doesn't matter where you're working. If you just say, hey, I'm going to WrestleMania for the week. That's going to be my vacation. No one's going to say, what's wrong with you? You're going to wrestling for the week?
Yeah.
Hulk Hogan was in San Antonio, and I was playing for the San Antonio Riders. And Mike Riley, who ended up coaching with San Diego and then ended up coaching the Nebraska football team, was the head coach. Mike had a wonderful sense of humor, and I got tickets to go see Hogan wrestle. So I was obviously a big wrestling fan, and played football down there. So then Mike announces in the team gathering before practice that there was a team meeting after practice. So I've got these freaking tickets to the wrestling match, and I'm like, the whole practice, like for 3 hours, I'm sulking, I'm pouting, I'm like mad and all this stuff. And as soon as Mike says, I called him Coach Riley, of course. Coach Riley says, John, I'm kidding. There's no meeting. Have fun at the wrestling. You bastard. You just ruined 3 hours of my life. And I went. Yes. It was great.
But somebody else would have taken that rib further and just kept you there. In fact, if Vince was pulling that rib, you would have missed the match.
I'd have missed the match completely. No, there's no doubt about it. There's no doubt about it.
Oh yeah, something I found that's very interesting that I didn't know. So you taught me something. That pay-per-view was blacked out in the Detroit area.
Yes,
and you had a lot of upset people over that. And then they came back and made almost $500,000 reselling the
yes.
replay to the people that couldn't get it
right.
in the beginning.
Yes, a couple of weeks later.
Yeah. Wow.
Well, hey, what was the split between the pay-per-view and closed circuit? When did closed circuit completely get out?
And Jerry, you told me in the book.
Yeah, the closed circuit, I think, was right after WrestleMania III that the closed circuit
you said it went into the 90s, closed circuit.
So you still had it later in
Did you still have
I think we had it up to WrestleMania. Or I'm thinking Vegas was the last one. I'm not right,
so
I can't
Vegas,
really. I'm not really.
WrestleMania.
I got my books back there, but it'd take too long to pull the damn thing out again. So
was that WrestleMania 9? Was Vegas WrestleMania 9?
I'm not sure. I don't think so.
Because that was right before. I think that's when JR made his debut. Anyway, I'm going off.
Nine,
But that's
nine
a
was
long
that was
time.
that in Hartford though? Was nine?
Wait, there was the one. I thought there was 11. I could be wrong.
Well, I just
Yeah, I
looked
Hartford
it
could
was
be.
the
up.
one.
Hagler Leonard was 1987, and I watched it on closed circuit. So you still had it in 1987 because I
Yes, sir.
remember being
Look,
sick to my stomach that Hagler didn't win.
we did not have a cable TV in my section of Queens till 1989. But I don't remember going. I don't remember. Well, I was working for the company, so that's why I didn't have to like go watch it on closed circuit. I forget that.
Hey, Keith, in all your research, did you find out any time a panic in WrestleMania III by Vince? And I know probably the staff around him panicked.
The staff was panicking.
Yeah.
The staff was panicking. I mean, Jerry was right there. By all accounts, Vince apparently was pretty confident that he was going to pull it off. What do you say, Jerry?
Well, I know I was panicking. I was not at the actual facility. I was doing my promotions here, still doing my promotions here in Florida, and that's when I had all the cities. The most of the cities I had we'd built up to like 30 some odd cities, in the high 20 cities that I was promoting. So I would the only way I would panicking was if I'd lose a feed or lose or or something start lagging. Back in those days losing the feed really didn't happen a lot, but they started where they'd lose power, they'd start lagging and everything. And there were always rumors about conspiracy about somebody pulling the plug on you,
Right.
and all that. So,
Right.
and I got accused of doing that with WCW over in Lakeland because I went over earlier that day and saw the friend that was the building manager of mine, Alan Jackson, that was building manager there, had a meeting with him. And then that night they lose their power. Everybody blamed it on me.
Right.
You pulled the plug on WCW?
No, I didn't pull no. I didn't know how I electrocuted myself,
Right.
John. I wouldn't.
Did WrestleMania III, Keith, when it was done, did everybody know this was a stake in the heart? This was. Vince is basically spiking the football.
I mean, I with all the people, look, I spoke to, David Crockett. I spoke to Greg Gagne. I spoke to Greg. I spoke to Bill Watts. I spoke to Dan Bynum, who was the director of WCCW. I spoke to Ross Hart from the Hart family, about what was going on in Calgary. I don't think anybody at that point was saying, we can still beat Vince. I think at that point they knew the future was pretty much decided. Guys, stayed in business. Vern refused to quit. Jim Crockett ended up selling to Ted Turner, which drastically changed the game. But that was in 88. And I think that was the point where nobody was going to ever be in the wrestling business without being essentially a billionaire. That the days of somebody getting a nice tax return and becoming a successful wrestling promoter, those days were long gone.
Specifically, the Vern Gagne. You had Greg interviewed many times in the book, and Greg, was very articulate about. He would find out that Vince had paid for a TV that took it away from them, so they would say, "We'll give you 2,500." Vince just gave us 3,000. Okay, we'll give you 3,500. Vince just gave us 4. Now after WrestleMania III, and after seeing all this, Greg seeing all this, what was AWA's thoughts? Did you realize? What are you going to do now? That because you can't.
Greg wanted Vern to retire, and Vern just wouldn't do it. And Vern ended up actually even losing money on his real estate investments. He was so committed to keeping the AWA alive, and he was just hanging on by his fingernails. And, he didn't have the bandwidth to compete anymore.
If Vern had treated Hogan different, is history different?
Yeah, but look, it's a different mentality. Vince saw Hogan and said, "This could be my lightning."
Yeah.
I would guess Vern saw Hogan and he said, here's a bass player and a bodybuilder. Jack Briscoe is a champ. Nick Bockwinkel is a champ. Dory Funk Jr. is a champion. Oh, Hogan's not a traditional champion. And I say this in the book. There were people who thought, he's too big to be a champion. The champion has to be a giant killer. That's how you rally behind. So would he have even had the money would he have been willing to spend the money to hold on to Hogan? Would he have known how to market him once he had him with the title? And I think Vince is the only one who would have known how to.
You're exactly right. That's what my philosophy I've always had. That there was only one guy that knew how to handle Hulk Hogan. And Hogan, knowing him like I do, and knowing him back in those days, he wouldn't have been content to just be in Minneapolis. Right from the very beginning, right when Jack and I started messing around with Terry and trying to guide him. His mind and Jack was probably the biggest culprit of all. He said, "You're a New York guy. That's the only place that you'll go that you'll be recognized because you're too big to go anywhere else." You kind of hit on it where he was too big to be the champion there. I think that's what hindered him with Vern. Vern just saw guy 6'7", 300+ pounds. I got nobody. I got the Baron who's 6'5" and 280, but he don't look like Hogan,
No, he doesn't look like Hogan, and he was aging. I mean,
yeah. And so I think Vince is the only one that had the vision of a superhero. And at an early age, he saw Hogan when Jack and I very first sent him to senior up there, that he saw this guy, and then he kind of disappeared. But even when Hogan was making the big bucks with Vern, and he would come home, he'd come out. I remember one day, broke out my yard, and there's 10 motorcycles come down. It's Hogan, Beefcake, and all of his family, Hogan family, all on motorcycles driving down my driveway. Hogan come down, "Hey, dude, I'm ready to go to New York." I said, "Well, when you make up your mind you're really serious, let me know, because you're doing good up there." And he said, I'm getting there. About a month later, him and Beefcake came over by themselves, and Jack made the call to Vince Sr. to get him up there. But I don't think anybody could have had that perception to turn Hogan into a cartoon character, and that's basically what we turned him into.
And look, there had been some precedent in Japan, but Hogan was not a regular in Japan. He was a special attraction in Japan.
Yeah.
And I don't even know if an Antonio Inoki could have, built a promotion around Hulk Hogan as a champion in Japan.
Yeah, it's so tough for those that are listening. The reason is because having a babyface be your biggest person in the territory, especially a monster like Hogan, you got nobody that can get heat on him. And that's what you guys are talking about. For the fans that are listening that don't understand why a big guy is tough to put a championship belt on when he's not a heel, or she is not a heel. It's tough sometimes because you got to have somebody that can get heat on the guy. And when you're Hogan, you gotta manufacture the world to get heat on that.
I mean, look, when you were the champion, you had Eddie Guerrero, even though he was smaller than you, when you guys were going back and forth. And I mean, he was perhaps one of the greatest in-ring performers who ever lived. I'm not sure there were a lot of guys who could have made, well, Angle could have, but could have made it as believable that you guys were equal to each other in the championship.
Yeah, it's tough. It's tough. It's
you got to have a roster full of hills like John if you're going to go that direction. Unfortunately, we had some good hills, but John realized that size different and was able to adapt to it. Eddie, could other hills done it? Maybe not as good, but it was possible.
Yeah, and so with Hogan in New York, Jack was the one that was pushing him to go to New York, Jerry?
From the very first day, that we sat down and talked to Terry. I mean, this is after Hero had done the damage to him, and he started working a little bit. And actually, when I was doing the booking with Johnny Valentine at the time, and I'm trying to book him as best I could, but Johnny didn't have a clue. Now here's this old time great heel, great psychologist in our business, that he didn't have a clue what to do with Terry because of his size. Because here in Florida, our biggest guy was Dusty Rhodes. Dusty was only 6'1", and he couldn't stay with him, But and so that's when we decided to send Terry out for a while, and then Terry came back but we had a meeting, and Jack told Terry, New York's going to be the place, but you're not ready for New York yet. And then when you get ready, when you get some experience, come and see me. And that's exactly what Terry did. He went up and worked for the Fullers up in the Panhandle up there in Alabama, and then he knew he had the experience because guys were telling him, Terry, you're ready to make the move. It wasn't only Jack and I; other people were telling him New York is the place for you. So when you're a young talent like that, and you're a country guy, and that's what Terry was at the time, New York. You keep hearing that. That's where you want to be. And we knew and Jack and I both knew that Vern was just a pass through type place for Terry, that he would soon be in New York, and that's the way it worked out.
Hey, Keith, one thing else in your book, Bigger, Better, Badder, that I loved, because this is so interesting to me, because I did commentary for Vince, for years and years and years. And I'd always joke, okay, what are the rules of the cage match today? Because they change. But when you'd outline them to the fans, they understood it.
Right.
Today, it's a break on the ropes.
Right.
Today, it's no DQ. They would understand as long as you lay it out specifically. Hogan had slammed the Giant before it shaved. The Giant had been slammed a million freaking times. They had worked together several times.
I mean, they had wrestled each other, if you count tag matches, in excess of 60 times.
It's so great. It's so great how Vince just rewrote history. Instead, this guy's undefeated, never been slammed, all this stuff. It just
and look, there were guys who were on the card, the Rougeau brothers. They had been in Verdun, Quebec. They had seen Hogan and Andre wrestle there. And even they said they forgot because they put themselves in the movie. They were watching a movie. They didn't care what their eyes had seen. They went where their heart took them.
After WrestleMania III, it just seems like, things are going to cascade toward Vince. Starrcade, Vince famously creates Survivor Series, and I've heard Vince tell the story. It's really funny, but you have it in the book about when Vince is going to run Survivor Series. All of a sudden, he decides to run on Thanksgiving opposite Crockett, and leverage the fact that, by the way, if you guys carry Crockett, you're not carrying WrestleMania next year.
Yeah.
It just seems like after WrestleMania III, Vince had all the cards.
And, that's where David Crockett comes in the book. And he says, I was hating Vince. I was hating him a lot. But what David Crockett hated most was that he didn't get to do that to Vince. Vince did it to them, which tells the story about what all of these promoters. It wasn't just Vince steamrolling everybody because he was ruthless. They all would have done it to each other.
Sure. Keith, Mr. Brisco told me a couple days ago, he goes, have you read Keith's book yet? And I said, no, not yet. I had a couple days set aside to read it. And he says, you won't be able to put it down. And sure enough, I couldn't put it down. If you were kind enough to send us a PDF version, I read through it is so fascinating about such a wonderful place in time. I think the most important time to me, I think you're right, in our sports history. Did anything out of this surprise you or make you eyebrows?
I mean, a lot of things did. There were, look, like we mentioned Basil DeVito and Nelson Swegler. It's not like I was hanging out with those guys. In 1987, I was 27 years old. I was a wrestling fan who happened to have taken the one talent I have and channeled that into writing about something I love. But I wasn't social peers with those guys. Those were serious guys. So when I spoke about what was going on backstage and what was going on, not backstage, in the office town, what was going on between them and Vince, I didn't know any of that stuff. Because if I'd walked up to Basil and said, so what do you and Vince just talk about? I would have been bounced out of that place so fast.
That is so interesting. So you're like uncovering your life as well, writing this book.
In some ways, because I would not have Dan ask that stuff. It's like when you were wrestling The Undertaker, what would you have done to me if I'd say, so what's the finish tonight, John?
Of course, yeah. We would no way we'd let you in the
Right.
or anything else.
Yeah.
And but it's so interesting that you're there and you're now writing the book about it, and then you're uncovering basically your own life, what was going on behind the closed door that's just behind you.
Right, that I couldn't see through. And
That you think you know what. So let me ask you
Yeah.
this: did you kind of know what was going on, and were you right?
um, I was assuming that Hogan would win because Hogan was winning a lot. I knew that Andre wasn't, in his prime. I remember Andre was he was he training at Vince's house in the time going up to WrestleMania III? Because remember he was like out of commission for a while.
Yeah, Vince talked him into a surgery to come back, and then they got the rehab for him and all that. Just
and I think he
do
was
that
staying.
match.
Wasn't he staying at a hotel in Stamford during that period, like in the time leading up to WrestleMania III? So I knew Andre was not at his peak. I knew that much. I also saw him walking around backstage, and I wouldn't talk about what was going to happen in WrestleMania III, but I would small talk with him, backstage, or when I'd see him in the bar, more likely. So I kind of knew what was happening, but I didn't exactly. And in terms of business, I didn't know anything about what was happening. I knew it was going to be in the Pontiac Silverdome. I had no idea what those discussions were between Basil DeVito and Dick Glover and Vince McMahon. And I would not have asked because I wanted to stay in the wrestling business.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Keith, that brings me to this question here. You're a member of the magazine staff at the time. What was the attitude of the staff on that end of it? I mean, did they think Vince was crazy? I mean,
No.
Were they all disciples at the time following the brick road? Or what?
They didn't start to criticize Vince until the Ultimate Warrior had the title and business started to decline in the United States. But by 92, Europe began to explode. And, now there's a generation of wrestling fans, who are a generation younger than I am, who that's when they became passionate fans, watching Bret Hart and the Young Undertaker and Shawn Michaels. So even then, Vince was latching on to something that nobody here saw.
It's so interesting. And one other thing that was very interesting was your take. I guess your take it seemed very accurate on Dave Meltzer. Meltzer it's a love-hate relationship with most of the guys in the business, and it's usually one or the other. But it's so interesting that I guess he was the first one that came along that wanted to be a journalist behind the scenes, which is when you have a business that's kayfabe, you don't want somebody behind the scenes.
Right.
But the fans, but the fans do.
Yeah.
The fans do, and the wrestlers did, because as much as they badmouth what you're saying, they did not.
What? No, Jerry said it was interesting. He didn't say.
Yeah.
Because if you feel you're not getting the push you deserve, or you feel you're not getting the money you deserve, 2:00 in the morning when you're hammered, you call Meltzer up and bitch to him, and now the whole wrestling community. He was a very convenient vehicle for the talent to have. But what I found fascinating about this was that the one person who encouraged him was Bruiser Brody, who you'd never think.
Yeah.
But Bruiser Brody had worked as a sports reporter.
Yeah.
And he said, this business needs a reporter, be it. And that's something I never knew. And, I was never a source for Meltzer and still am not. But I've certainly had conversations with Meltzer over the years, and I never would have imagined this.
Yeah, I wouldn't have imagined Brody. That's shocking when I read that. I can understand.
Me too, because I knew Brody well.
Mindset, but Brody was biggest kayfabe guy in the world.
Right. Right.
But it all made sense the way you presented it in the book, though. At Brody in Dallas, he was a sports reporter in Dallas, and before he got into business, so he knew how that felt to be kind of pushed to the side, not be told the truth on everything. So I could see that relationship, but still, it's hard for me to visualize Bruiser Brody, and Dave Meltzer talking.
That's right. That's not a combination you think's gonna happen.
No, but then again, who would have known that Bill Watson Meltzer would talk?
Yeah.
100%. That shocked me too.
Yeah.
Yeah,
that didn't shock me as much, and I tell you why, because Bill's a businessman, and Bill realized the fact that Meltzer could get the word out that he wanted to get out, and Bill would rather have his word get out than one of the talent's word get out. So that's the reason I visualized why Bill was friendly with. Where Brody was a talent, and I can't. That's the hard visualization to me.
But Jerry Lawler would send pictures, different situations. There's promotion to Bill to the after bags, all the time.
What you bring up in your book there too.
That's right, for self promotion, and Lawler was way ahead of everybody else. So I can understand what you're saying about Bill Watson.
Yeah.
Meltzer. Yeah. Well, Keith, first, thank you so much for coming on, and thank you for the book. I could not put the damn thing down.
I greatly appreciate that.
It's excellent. I recommend it to everybody out there. You've got to read this book. It's about the most important time, I believe, in wrestling history. What was your biggest takeaway from it? Did you have something that you came out of it that thought this? You can sum it up in a small paragraph, or you can sum it up in something, a biggest takeaway.
I just feel, I know I'm still making friends for life in the wrestling business. I talk to a lot of the young wrestlers when I'm at WWE and AEW events, and I talk to a lot of fans. And if you truly want to understand the way the business is now, you have to really understand how significant WrestleMania III was for the entire industry. And if I captured that, well, that'll live long after I'm gone.
Can something like that,
my friend?
Can something like that? Obviously, it can. There's nothing impossible. I guess will something like that happen again? A seminal moment like that, a big event.
I don't want to say no. I don't want to be like one of these old guys clinging to the past and saying nothing will ever be better. I mean, I do know that there's something like 1,000 requests for the press box for WrestleMania 41. John Cena turning bad is generating a lot of attention outside the wrestling world. So who knows? In 25 years from now, I'll be 91? Maybe I'll do another book.
John Cena, I was amazed. I'm a big John Stewart fan, and one of the American political analysis guys, and he spent 20 minutes of his show talking about John Cena turning bad,
yeah,
comparing it with Zelensky and Trump and all that. So,
right, yeah.
I have a guy.
What our sport has turned to.
I have a guy that I go all the time. I go down and get a hot dog from, and I've known the guy for years. I speak to him a little bit in Spanish, but he didn't speak much. We just kind of exchange pleasantries. That's about it. And I went yesterday. I stopped by there, and I want to give me a double cheeseburger. And as I'm leaving, he says, "What do you think about John Cena turning heel?" I didn't even know he spoke English.
Even though the guy
tweeting about John Cena turning heel, and I said, "I tried to tell you 20 years ago how bad he was. Y'all wouldn't listen." Hey, Keith, thank you so much for joining us. As bigger, better, badder, where all can they get it?
It's actually called Bigger, Better, Badder, WrestleMania III and the Year It All Changed. And you can get it anywhere. You can walk into a bookstore and get it. You can order it directly from ECW Press. And I'll give a shout out to my executive editor, Michael Holmes, who believed in this from the very day I pitched it to him on the phone. And you can go to Amazon.com, BarnesandNoble.com. If you're living in the UK or abroad, whatever website you go to, you can get it from any place where you can buy books. You can get this book. And, hopefully there'll be a few more printings. And then ECW Press will have to take out a line of credit to pay me my royalties.
Yeah.
I hope they
Is there any spoilers you can give us? Is there anything coming up soon from Keith Greenberg that we should be looking for?
There is another project I have on the horizon, but at this point, I'm going to have to kayfabe.
Okay, thank you.
No, we understand. The book, though, and all wrestling fans out there, you will be happy you got it. Keith,
Yes, you will.
Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you, John. Thank you, Jerry. And hope to just continue talking with you guys both here and privately.